Everybody, this is Dream, and today we've got a nice little 6-game slate here for college basketball that starts at 7 p.m. Overall, this slate is going to have a lot of blowout-style games, but there's a couple close games. The highest-scoring teams, I think, are going to be Houston and Creighton, along with Penn State. So it's an interesting little slate. Florida, too, looks pretty decent today, especially in a nice plus matchup. But all these games are mostly kind of blowout potential with the exception of Penn State and Butler. So with that said, let's get into the slate. Let's get into the guards that we like here. Before I do, though, can you smash that like and subscribe button? That really helps the channel. I really do appreciate it. We're going to start with Umunjo Gibson for DePaul. Now, he has scored 44 and 32 fantasy points his first 2 games. His price point is pretty high, but he is averaging 1.3 fantasy points per minute, and he is playing over 30 minutes a game, so I do think he's in a great spot. As you can see, DraftKings still has last year's stats here, so just that's not too important, basically. But anyway, he's a guy that I really do like on the slate. I don't like a ton of guys that are over like 7,000 typically in college basketball because they're really, once you get above a certain point, with the way minutes work in college, it tends to not, it kind of becomes cost prohibitive. But sometimes there's a good slate like this where you can pay up for 1 or 2 guys. And this slate, you could definitely fit high. You got a high-priced guy in there, so I do have a few of these type of guys included. Another guy like that is Jalen Pickett here for the Penn State. Now he was really good last season, and he's been pretty consistent to start this year. He had 42 and 26 fantasy points the first 2 games. He's also a 1.13 fantasy point per minute in those games, including playing over 30 minutes as well. So I think that both those guys, Pickett and Gibson, are both in interesting spots. Now to get a little bit cheaper, we're going to look at Cam Winter here for Penn State. He's going to play around 24 minutes or 25 minutes here. He had 22 and 28 fantasy points in the first 2 games of the season with a good 1.09 fantasy point per minute stat. So I do think he's in a really good spot here, and I do like him on this particular slate. Good price point as well, and a pretty safe play with his minutes being around the mid-20s. Then we're going to look at Seth Lundy. Now, he can play guard or forward for Penn State on the slate. Now, his price point is nice and cheap at $5,700. His fantasy points per minute lasts is right around 1 fantasy point per minute, and he's had 22 and 16 fantasy points the first 2 games. The only real risk with him is he only played about 22 minutes in those first 2 games, so we do have to have that as a little bit of a concern. As you can see, last year he played well over that amount of minutes, so maybe it's just the first 2 games of the season. But overall, he is a little bit risky because of the minutes, but he is a pretty good play. Then we'll look at Marcus Sasser, who's at $4,700. He seems too cheap for what he's done so far. He's had 38 and 20 fantasy points in these first 2 games, averaging a 1.02 fantasy point per minute, and he's playing well over 30 minutes each game. He has some upside in this matchup here in a game that they're favored to win. Surprising that his price is that cheap. Then we're going to look Lukulis for Butler. Now, he's another guy that can play guard or forward, so keep that in mind. But he has only played 1 game so far this season. He had 26 fantasy points in that game, which was good for 0.98 fantasy points per minute, and he played about 27 minutes. So I think he's in a pretty good spot, and he should be able to play a pretty complement amount of minutes in this game, and it should be a close game as well. Then we'll look at Tremont Mark here for Houston. He had 14 and 22 fantasy points the first 2 games, which is only a 0.81 fantasy point per minute in the 22 or so minutes. But he is a decent value play. He's not a guy that's going to play a crazy amount of minutes a lot of times. But as you can see, even last year he kind of played in the 18 to 20 minute range, and so I expect him to have a similar output, somewhere in the mid-20s, hopefully, in this matchup. Then we'll look at Isaac McBride for Oral Roberts. Now he has been inconsistent as a player last season, but he's playing about 28 minutes so far this season, and he had 21 and 28 fantasy points the first 2 games, and I think that that's a pretty good starting point for him. His team isn't favored to win today, I don't think, but they're not. But he should be the one good player on their team. So then we'll look at forwards. We're going to start with Castleton for Florida. Now he's played in 2 games, and he had 57 and 32 fantasy points. Now obviously his price point is super high, but he had a whopping 1.53 fantasy points per minute, and he's playing 30 plus minutes. He is the best forward on the slate, but again, you do have to be a little bit, because college basketball is college basketball, getting 50 fantasy point games over and over is not something that typically happens. Then we'll look at Ryan Kalkbrenner. I don't know how to say your name, but from Creighton. Now, he's had 23 and 34 fantasy points. He's also pretty expensive, but he has a 1.14 fantasy point per minute, and he's playing over 27 minutes. So he does have some interest. Last season, he averaged 29.8 as well. So he's a pretty decent play. Again, these guys, you only really want to use them if you're able to, when you're fixing the lineup and you've got that amount of money left over for the last couple spots, then you definitely take a look at these guys. And then finally, Manny Bates. He's another guy that fits in that category for Butler. Now, he has 48 fantasy points in his first game this season. I'm not sure. Oh, last year he only played one game, I guess. He had 48 fantasy points in his first game and had a whopping 1.78 fantasy points per minute. Obviously, we're going to have to see if he's going to be able to do that again. But he's in an interesting spot here. He had 25 points in that first game, as you can see on the thing right up down there. He should be able to get 28, 30 minutes in this game, and this should be a tight game, so he's going to have to do everything. So we'll have to see how he does. Then for guys that are much more viable, your Ani for DePaul here against Minnesota. He is a really good value play here at $5,000. He's at 1.08 fantasy points per minute with 23 and 25 fantasy points in the first two games. And he's playing about 25 minutes, so I think he's in a good spot here. And then we're going to look at Dawson Garcia for Minnesota. Now he's $5,900, and he had a 1.27 in the first two games with 23 and 35 fantasy points, and he played about 24 minutes. So I think he's a pretty good play today. Juwan, Roberts. There we go. Sorry. For Houston, he had 39 and 26 fantasy points in his first two games, and his price point is just too cheap for what he's done. He had 1.31 fantasy points per minute, and he's playing about 26 minutes. Houston's favorite to win this game pretty largely, so I do like him as well. And then finally, last but not least, Javon Johnson for DePaul. He had 43 and 26 fantasy points his first two games, good for 1.9 fantasy points per minute. And he's been playing around 30 minutes. His price point is just way too cheap. I don't know any way else to say it. So, with that said, it's a very interesting slate. We got a lot of good value plays available here, so I think you can mix and match those guys and then get some expensive dudes in just to, to kind of safeguard the lineup overall. And as you know, we can use 3 guards, 3 forwards, and then 2 utilities. And we did mention 2 guys in Seth Lundy and Simas Lukulis who can play both guard and forward, so you can put them anywhere if you choose to use them. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.